Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Veda Bromel and along with me I have my colleagues Ms. Nishita Prasad and Sir Nigel Bryden. Alright, so in Unit 3 we will be looking at experimental design, and when we look at experimental design it talks about behavioral analysis and classroom management. Alright, so this slide here shows us what we learn in this unit. We'll explain experimental design and the basic parts of an experiment. We'll also look at an example and discuss its strengths and limits. And also by the end, you should be able to have an understanding of how experiments show cause and effect. Alright, so let's get right into it. Experimental approach, the big idea. You might be wondering, what is an experimental approach? Well, an experimental approach tests cause and effect in human behavior. Educators can randomly assign students into groups, give each student a different treatment, and compare the results. And in a case like this, any behavioral difference between groups can be reliably linked to the treatment. I will now hand you over to my colleague, Ms. Nishida, and she'll take us more into the logic of experimental approach.
Thank you, Ms. Bromel. So here is now we move on to the core logic order. So firstly, we have two types of variable. We have the independent variable, and this is known to be the treatment. And we have the dependent variable, which is the variable that is normally observed, and this is the behavior. Now, as an educator, let's say we create an assignment, and we randomly place students into groups. And mainly doing this will firstly reduce biasness and will help us to see how one group perform compared to the other. Now the key part of an experiment. First of all, we have the participants, and this can be the classroom, a group of grade 8 or grade 9 students, and they have similar background. Now, giving them this assignment and then randomly placing them into groups by either putting their names on an Excel document and randomly sorting it, or just as simple as putting their name into a bag and actually allowing them to pull it, can actually randomly place them into groups. And why we do this is mainly to actually reduce selection biasness. We do not want all the students that we deem to be high flyers in one group and all the students we deem to be low flyers in another group. Now the treatment. So for the experiment, we have two variables, as mentioned before, independent, which can change, and dependent. Now, in simple language, independent variable, this is always changeable by the educator or by the researcher. And the dependent variable is actually the variable that is measured after the change. Now, how an experiment is conducted. Before we can start an experiment, we need to ask ourselves, what are we experimenting? What causes what exactly? Then, secondly, we need a target population. But this brings us to our third stage. With the target population, we have to ensure that firstly they have a similar background and they must be assigned randomly. And by doing it randomly, we have many methods. We can either put their names in an Excel document and assort it. We can put their names in a bag and just pull it. There's many methods. Then we have applying these different treatments at the same duration. Why I say at the same duration is because we need to measure the behavior after that specific treatment period. And this will allow us to draw a very concise conclusion or a good conclusion of what was one group performance compared to the other group performance with the same treatment and the same time period. Now here we have a work example. Now the first thing is both groups was randomly assigned. One was watching violent TV content and the other was watching non-violent TV content on the same period of time, which was about 6 weeks. Now the educator will actually try to assess the aggressiveness in the play behavior. We find that in group A it shows more aggression, and this was influenced by the content they consume. Now, it is important as researcher or educator when conducting this study that we know, okay, what actually count as aggressive player, and then we have to also keep in mind the factors similar across the other groups. Here is where I will now hand over the presentation to Sir Nigel to continue.
Thank you, colleagues. Moving on, I will be speaking on experimental design, focusing on identifying variables, its advantages, and ethical consideration. So, identifying the variables. This example shows cause and effect. The independent variable is a type of television program, violent or not violent. The dependent variable is the children's aggressive behavior. By changing what children watch, we observe how their behavior changes. In this example, the variable, which is the independent variable, is the amount of praise given by the teacher. The dependent variable is students' on-task behavior. This shows how teacher attention or actions can influence student behavior. Moving on, advantages of experimental design. So experimental design, it allows the researcher to control conditions and manipulate variables. It helps to clearly identify cause and effect relationships, which is useful for improving classroom practices. Limits and ethics. So experiments do have limits because not all behaviors can be tested. Ethical guidelines, therefore, must be followed, especially when working with children, to ensure safety, consent, and well-being. So experimental design, in summary, helps us to understand how different factors affect a child's behavior. When used carefully and ethically, it is a powerful tool for improving teaching and classroom management. Thank you, and this brings us to the end of our presentation.